Welcome to Breaking the Set. I'm Abby Martin. Well, earlier this week, MSNBC contributor Rula Jabril made waves when she criticized the media's coverage, including that of her own network, of Israel's aggression in Gaza. In an interview with Ronan Farrow, Jabril accused pro-Israel lobbying groups like Apache for hindering politicians' ability to speak honestly on the conflict. However, she took her critique one step further, condemning the amount of airtime Israeli politicians like Netanyahu are given compared to their Palestinian counterparts.
1/10 is giving to the Palestinian voice and 99% to the Israeli voice, and that's why the public opinion is pro-Israeli, which is the opposite in the rest of the world.
Within hours of her statement, Jabril tweeted that all of her forthcoming TV appearances on MSNBC had been canceled. Well, after the network came under fire for canceling her contract, MSNBC's Chris Hayes invited her on yesterday to challenge her view that journalists have a responsibility to cover the reality of Palestinian suffering. And hilariously, while of course her title as MSNBC contributor had been revoked, the network decided to label her as a Palestinian journalist instead. Wow. As journalist Max Blumenthal pointed out on Twitter, can you imagine people like Eli Lake being titled as Jewish American when being interviewed about Israel? The simple answer is you can't. Because as we've seen time and time again, the mainstream media paints Palestinians as the other, a lone, distant voice that can only sympathize with its own people. And once someone is merely labeled Palestinian, it's acceptable to exclude them from the debate. Now let's break the set.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
And once again, we put something on the air. It's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait. Do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire untold. These ones are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set. Breaking the set. Breaking the set.
If you've ever been to Thailand or Amsterdam, you would know that prostitution is a booming industry in many parts of the world, bringing in billions of dollars and millions of visitors every year. Now, of course, prostitution laws vary by country, but whether it's an outright ban or a fully regulated industry, one thing is for sure. Just like drug use, there will always be a demand, and there's no law in the world that will ever change that. While official numbers are difficult to gather, in the U.S. it's estimated that prostitution generates $14 billion annually, despite its illegality. And according to a 2004 ABC poll, as many as 30% of single American men over the age of 30 admit to having paid for sex at least once in their lives. Now, the debate over legalization or decriminalization usually falls under a moral argument, often ignoring the benefits that such a policy change could generate, specifically for the women involved. Except in the case of Nevada, where multiple counties in the state do currently permit legal brothels, and with resounding success. According to the New York Times, 84% of women working in legal Nevada brothels feel safe, perhaps because most of them work for themselves and therefore don't need abusive and controlling pimps in the picture. Furthermore, these legal prostitution hubs have no evidence of trafficking. But as far as the rest of the country, unfortunately, the underground nature of prostitution leaves little data for social scientists to observe. Until this month, when the National Bureau of Economic Research published a report on the effect of decriminalizing indoor prostitution. The report cites a 15-year study showing that as much as 85% of all sex work activity in the U.S. is moving indoors to places like escort agencies, massage parlors, and the internet. It also highlights a curious case study of the decriminalization of indoor prostitution in the state of Rhode Island. See, in 2003, a Rhode Island district judge ruled that indoor prostitution was no longer a felony. By 2009, however, its governor signed a law once again criminalizing the practice. And while the motivations for the initial ruling and following ban are debatable, the data observed during the time it was decriminalized is irrefutable. Not only did decriminalized prostitution lead to a decrease in sex-related arrests, but a 31% drop in rape reports, as well as significantly fewer cases of STDs. It's a first-of-its-kind study in the U.S. and one that blows previous hypotheses out of the water as they relate to rape and STDs, not only for sex workers, but for the entire population. Now, in regard to sexual violence, it's been argued that decriminalization would lead to an increased market, which then leads to an increase in violence against women. But once again, the data suggests otherwise. In fact, the authors of the report add that, quote, decriminalization may also reduce violence by increasing sex workers' willingness to cooperate with police and reducing opportunities for police corruption. Prostitutes commonly report a reluctance to contact the police when they are the victims of theft or violence. This is perhaps one of the most important takeaways, especially considering the fact that sex workers are often the victims of police violence themselves. See, cops routinely target prostitutes during sting operations, and in some absurd cases, even have sex with prostitutes before arresting them, you know, just to make sure. And it happens more often than you'd like to think. Just this month, a police officer in Florida was arrested by another undercover officer posing as a prostitute. The continued crackdown on sex workers is only costing taxpayers at the end of the day. One only has to look at the case of Jennifer Sue Hurd, a sex worker in Ohio who had been arrested 45 times on separate charges, eventually costing Ohio residents $100,000. So let's stop sitting up on our high horses and judging every sex worker as a drugged-out lowlife who's being demeaned by the industry. Instead, we should embrace the fact that legalizing and decriminalizing prostitution will actually empower women who choose this profession, give them the resources they need to protect themselves and others. Because as much as you may want to turn a blind eye to reality, you can't deny the facts. Earlier this month, Obama asked Congress for a $3.7 billion emergency package to address the flow of unaccompanied minors crossing into the U.S. But the funding is little more than a tourniquet to stem the growing humanitarian crisis along the U.S.-Mexico border. Just this week, the Senate responded to Obama's request by slashing $1 billion of that funding, citing the initial amount was simply over budget. This blatant dismissal comes as Congress eagerly preps for its August recess. But as lawmakers prepare for a 5-week vacation from governance, tens of thousands of children sit in holding cells, military bases, and repurposed warehouses along the border, waiting in limbo for their cases to be heard. So to help me break down how bad this crisis really is and why Congress is stalling immigration reform, I'm joined by Breaking the Set producer Manuel Rapolo. What's going on, dude?
Thanks, Abby.
Good to see you. So let's talk about this emergency $3.7 billion funding. What exactly was it going to be used for, and why are lawmakers rejecting the sum?
Right, and of that $3.7 billion, I'm glad that you mentioned that Congress is now saying, you know, this is we're way over budget. We're not gonna
we gotta
give you
spend it in Syria and Iraq.
Yeah,
and
we gotta spend
Israel.
it funding apartheid in Israel. The money is going to kind of give a little bit of relief to ICE agents and CPB agents and the Department of Health and Human Services that are completely overburdened with the amount of just the influx of unaccompanied minors right now. And unfortunately, Congress going into August, which by the way, that headline read that the funding for border protection is going to be running out by September. That is actually, according to Jay Johnson from Homeland Security, will be running out by August at the rate that it's burning right now. So it's desperately needed. We're talking about a record number of unaccompanied minors coming in. And the fact that Congress is leaving town for 5 weeks sends a really, really bad message. Not to say that if they were here, they'd get something done, but it does send a really, really bad message that they're not going to be.
Well, it's a shame that it's even going to run out before even the expected deadline because, as we know, the system itself is so overburdened as it stands. Talk about the stresses already on that.
Right. I mean, we're talking right now upwards of 70,000 children that have come in. Unaccompanied minors are not here with their parents. This is just children that we're talking about since October. By fall of this year, by September, the White House has already estimated that it's going to be upwards of 90,000. We're talking about a system that was designed under the Bush administration to house 8,000. kids.
Wow.
And we're expected to, before the end of the year, be at 90,000. I mean, these statistics are really, really troubling, and the fact that we're now being forced to turn abandoned warehouses, makeshift shelters for these kids, turn military facilities into these kids. So this funding is desperately needed, not only for Border Patrol, who's going to run out of money, but for Health and Human Services to find a place for these children.
Right, and I remember reading reports that these kids are sometimes getting beaten in these warehouses. I mean, abysmal conditions, sometimes no better than where they left behind. Of course, being driven out by so much violence in Latin America, where you're from, Manny. Not only is this overcrowding of facilities taking place, but also the processing. I mean, and that's adding to this problem, is the length of time that it takes to process these kids.
Yeah, and are you ready for these statistics? But this is really, really troubling. It can take upwards of 19 months to process a single case. And as of June of this year, and this is Department of Justice statistics here, 375,000 cases are pending. Okay, so we're not only talking about an influx into a system that's designed to house 8,000 kids. We're talking about thousands and thousands of cases that are going to take well over a year, probably over 2 years to process.
Why do they take that long?
Because that's the system. We keep hearing about this immigration system that's broken in America. This is what's broken about it. We're not just dealing with the millions of undocumented immigrants that are in the country already. We're having to deal with the thousands, tens of thousands that are continuing to come and overcrowd the existing facilities, having to put them into facilities that don't even exist, and then deal with and this is in no way their fault. These are kids that are coming into a system that simply cannot accommodate for them.
And what's so unfortunate is that the debate is so dumbed down because you have Republicans actually blaming Obama for creating this crisis, and then you have Obama kind of the deporter-in-chief responsible for more deportations.
And that's the saddest part about this argument, is that it's so heavily politicized when we should really be taking this for what it is, which is a humanitarian crisis. Now, thankfully, the media in America, whether it be MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, RT, or whatever, is turning that page, and we are treating it like a humanitarian crisis, but we now need the political will from Congress to see it the same way.
Right, and unfortunately, states are taking the matters into their own hands, for better or for worse. Talk about that.
Yeah, and I mean, this is another one of those things that sends the wrong message. The federal government should be setting the standard. The federal government should be setting the guidelines for what we should be doing in terms of immigration policy. As a result, like you said, states are taking matters into their own hands. California, New Mexico, Connecticut, several states are passing their own versions of the DREAM Act. Certain cities across the country are passing their own legislation to give licenses to undocumented immigrants. These are sort of like the positives that are coming out of this, but it shouldn't be up to these states to do it. It should be up to the federal government. Other states don't have that heart-friendly approach. Texas, for example, sent 1,000 troops, 1,000 National Guard troops. Rick Perry, 1,000 National Guard troops to the border. That, again, sending the wrong message about how we're
message. And Manny, we have about 30 seconds left, but I mean, a lot of this problem, as we mentioned before, stems from the drug war and a lot of these policies in Latin America, Central America, that's driving these kids to the U.S. You're from Honduras. Talk about how that's all part of it.
Right. I mean, I'm not going to blame all of U.S. policy for the reason that this immigration crisis is going on. But yes, the U.S. drug war, U.S. policies, economic policies that are displacing workers in Honduras, creating violence that's forcing these kids to leave. That's all a big factor, and that's all something that we need to start looking at.
Exactly. There's so much here. Manny Rapolo, really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Ed.
Coming up, I'll be talking about the roots of the Palestinian and Israeli conflict and why understanding it can help end the violence today.
What are your thoughts on what's been going on in Washington?
Well, it's a mess, Larry. I mean, the whole country is being scoffed at and laughed at.
Enough is enough.
The media, the candidates, the corporatocracy, covering issues that actually affect you and me doesn't do too much for ad revenue.
Biotech agriculture giant takes on a 76-year-old American farmer based in Indiana.
How much fallout do you think this is going to create for the CIA?
Do you think this is what's triggering the crisis?
America's the largest economy in the world. It's also the largest debtor nation in the history of the world.
Breaking the set is mostly about alternatives to the status quo, but one that gave real alternatives a voice.
One minute they were working toward the American dream, the next they were just trying to survive the night. It's time for Americans and lawmakers in Washington to wake up and start talking about the real causes of poverty in America.
Since July 8, Israel has been engaged in a brutal offensive against Gaza, dubbed Operation Protective Edge. But the country's bombing campaign and subsequent invasion of Gaza has reached a tipping point. With scores of civilians dying every day, the media is no longer able to ignore the bloodshed. At least 690 Palestinians have been killed at the time of this broadcast, and over 4,500 left injured, according to the Middle East Eye. At least 161 of the dead are children. That's one child being killed every hour in Gaza, according to the UN. Now, on the Israeli side, 3 civilians and 32 IDF soldiers have died during the latest siege. According to Palestinian health officials, Israel's military has targeted mosques, schools, and more than 25 health facilities, including elderly care units and hospitals. So far, over 100,000 Palestinians have been displaced from the violence. As horrifying as these developments are, this is a tragic tale that's all too familiar. Here in the West, we're taught that Israel is a country surrounded by terrorists who want to destroy it, and that a constant barrage of rocket fire threatens its way of life, which gives Israel the right to defend itself over and over again. A defense that facilitates more than $3 billion a year in military aid from U.S. taxpayers, more than any other country receives in support. So given the overwhelming amount of U.S. support for one side of the conflict, what are its roots? And who is the true instigator of violence? To break it all down, I'm joined by Alison Weir, author of Against Our Better Judgment, the hidden history of how the U.S. was used to create Israel, and founder of If Americans Knew. Thanks so much for coming on, Alison.
Thank you for having me.
So, Alison, for the last decade, the media has been saying any violence is justified by Israel's right to defend itself from rocket fire going back all the way to 2001. Debunk the talking point that all of this started with Hamas rockets.
Yes, it's very easy to debunk that. The media just sort of doesn't bother to look at the actual facts for some reason. The fact is that the first rocket from Gaza was launched in April of 2001. In 2001, a total of 4 rockets were launched from Gaza. I was in Gaza before that, in February and March of 2001, before any of these rockets had been launched. And I personally saw, and many other people did too, that Israeli forces were shelling Gaza at that time nightly. They were also shelling parts of the West Bank. In Gaza, I would go through some residential neighborhoods, and especially in southern Gaza, that were completely bullet-riddled by Israeli mortar fire, rocket fire. They were using F-16s at that time already, helicopter gunships. I saw large residential homes full of families that were in ruins in February and March of 2001. Already that year, I believe Israeli forces had killed about 35 Palestinian children before any of the rocket launches started. So obviously there was a great deal of violence coming from Israeli forces that preceded the rockets. It's also...
Yeah, sure, go on.
Well, I was going to mention the other thing that the media says, which is of course following the Israeli talking point, is that it is because of Hamas that Israel is engaging in one assault after another on Gaza. But Hamas was elected in 2006, and we already saw a number of invasions of Gaza, many people killed long before Hamas was elected.
According to your organization, Alison, Israel currently has 262 Jewish-only settlements built on confiscated Palestinian land and have demolished over 28,000 Palestinian homes. Let's take a look at that famous map showing Palestinian land loss since 1946 through the year 2000. I don't know if we have that map showing those 4 subsequent states. Under what legal pretense is this being justified?
Well, it's really not legal. This is against Geneva Conventions. You cannot acquire land through conquest, but Israel continues to do this. It's important for Americans to realize that Israel has never declared its borders. We are consistently told it's the only democracy in the Middle East, and yet it has not declared its borders because it has from the beginning had a plan to expand those borders, and it has done so. And in addition, it's never written a constitution. There isn't a constitution, so it can change its basic laws whenever it wishes to, and it does that.
And Israel says that they pulled out their troops from Gaza years ago. But Alison, as someone who's been there extensively, who's studied the area very extensively, talk about how the population is still being controlled in the occupied territories, how the border is still regulated in a way that blocks essential staples from reaching the people.
Yes, Gaza is basically, many people call it quite accurately, a large open-air prison. Israel controls the borders. It's very difficult to get into Gaza and to get out of Gaza because Israel and Egypt, which controls the southern border and does very much what the U.S. and Israel want it to do, makes it often impossible to leave Gaza and to get into Gaza. It's very difficult. So after the massacre that occurred a few years ago, in which about 1,400 Palestinians in Gaza, men, women, and many, many, many children were killed. Their homes, huge parts of Gaza were destroyed. I saw that too. Going in a year later, very little had been rebuilt because Israel was preventing building materials from going into Gaza. So people were still living in tents. Schools had not been rebuilt. Many hospitals had not been rebuilt, clinics. I talked to an Israeli Palestinian physician who explained to me operating rooms were undersupplied. They often didn't have anesthesia that's necessary for just simple standard operations. They didn't have X-ray film to use for X-rays. There were very significant medicines and medications, life-saving ones, that were insufficiently available in Gaza itself. There were a great many of small children who were suffering different types of diseases, easily treated ones, some of them causing excruciating pain for toddlers, for example, who then were not being allowed to leave Gaza to go for medical care. Gaza has been under a siege since Hamas was elected in 2006. But truthfully, before that, when I was there in a few years before that, it was also very difficult to get into and out of Gaza, even again, before Hamas was elected.
Right, so we have all the borders closed, even chocolate, pasta, anesthetics. I don't see how any of those things could be justified to not be allowed in Gaza. None of those things could be made into weapons, Alison. You talked about before 2006. Let's go back all the way to the beginning. You wrote a book called Against Our Better Judgment, which talks about the hidden history, about how Israel was created and why it was formed. What role did the U.S. play in its creation, Alison?
Well, in researching my book, I was astounded to learn that the movement to create Israel, called political Zionism, has existed in the United States since the late 1800s. And I grew up here, and I had never even heard of that movement, but it's a very significant one. U.S. officials in the State Department and the Pentagon and our intelligence agencies were actually opposed to supporting Zionism. Zionism was the intention of creating a Jewish state in Palestine, land that was already inhabited by a population that in the early 1900s was approximately 80% non-Jewish, I think it was. No, actually it was 95% at that point that was non-Jewish. So the idea was to dispossess that population and create a Jewish state on that land. There were major manipulations in the United States to push the Zionist agenda. I was astounded. There are a great many books that have documented that, just most people don't know about them because most of them are out of print. But there was major activism on behalf of Zionism. Some of it was very public. Much of it was kept hidden. There were a number of front groups for the groups that were in Palestine at that time, working to fight against the Palestinians who were living on that land. So it was, if people want to know, well, where did this violence in Gaza start? Do you go back to July 12th or maybe June 8th when the 3 Israelis were abducted? You learned that just before they were abducted, 4 Palestinian children had been killed. You learned that from the beginning of 2014, January 1st, there had been already 30 Palestinians killed before those 3 were abducted. So where do you start? Where do you go back? Well, to understand the beginning, you go back to the creation of Israel which occurred with a war of conquest in 1947 to 1949, in which approximately 750,000 people were pushed out to make way for a Jewish state. The Palestinian role in this, their original crime, was simply being on land that someone else wanted.
And all we hear today is that Hamas is this terrorist organization that's constantly using human shields and that they rejected this ceasefire. Alison, I mean, how did Hamas come to be, and why did the Palestinian Authority and Fatah fail in Gaza in gaining support?
Well, Gaza and the West Bank, both, it's important to remember that they're very much under the control of Israel. The governments within those two entities are there largely because Israel allows them to function to a degree. I mean, Israel controls the borders. We're talking about governments basically within prisons. So they have very limited power. Mm-hmm. Now, Gaza, but there was a fair election in which Hamas won the election. Under Fatah, which was the main Palestinian Authority, things had gotten worse. Israel had taken more Palestinian land. It had created more suffering for Palestinians. The Palestinian Authority had been unable to stop that. So here we have Hamas, a chance to change parties. That's usually considered a very positive thing for a democracy, to see that there is a sharing of power, that a different party can be elected. It was portrayed accurately at that time as not corrupt, that it would fight for the rights of Palestinians and try to prevent the continued confiscation of their land. So there was an election held. By all accounts, it was a fair election. Hamas was elected. Israel did not want that, so immediately Gaza in particular came under a great deal of pressure, especially economic pressure. Hamas was demonized, although it had won an election. There are resistance forces in the Palestinian territories that are armed, but Hamas was also a political party. It had done a great deal of, it had organized clinics, schools, etc.
Which, of course, then makes all of those fair game, I guess, for bombing targets. We have about 20 seconds left, Alison. Obviously, a two-state solution, it doesn't look like it's on the table. What can people do to help stop this violence, Alison? We have about 15 seconds.
Israel's power comes from the United States. It's our over $8 million per day. Really now it's moving up to about $10 million per day coming from the United States and the diplomatic shielding. Once more Americans start letting their elected officials know that we do not want our money used this way, that we do want peace in the Middle East,
absolutely,
and that funding Israel prevents it.
Thank you.
That's the only thing I think.
Thank you so much. We do need to stand up and demand that to be end. Alison Weir, author, founder of If Americans Knew. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at Abby Martin. Join me again tomorrow when I break the set all over again.